Robert Jenrick, one of the front-runners to replace Rishi Sunak as leader of the Conservative Party, has released a new video saying the UK must leave the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights.
Our special forces are killing rather than capturing terrorists because our lawyers tell us that if they're caught, the European Court will set them free.
Jenrick appears to be claiming that British special forces are killing rather than capturing terrorists because the ECHR requires prisoners to be released. It's completely absurd. The ECHR requires no such thing. This outrageous claim has prompted criticism from Jenrick's Conservative leadership rivals James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat, both of whom served in the army and are clearly more knowledgeable on this subject than Jenrick is.
As a former military man, do you agree with Robert Jenrick that the SAS kill rather than capture terrorists because otherwise under EU law they'd be freed?
No, I don't. I think what he said is wrong and I'm afraid demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of military operations and the law of armed conflict.
That's not something which I have heard. That's not something which I'm comfortable kind of repeating.
In his video, Jenrick went even further.
The convention has been twisted out of all recognition. Churchill signed up to a right to family life, not to keep terrorists on our streets.
Now Jenrick appears to be claiming that ECHR allows terrorists to be on our streets. Again, it's completely absurd. There's absolutely no reason why a person suspected of terrorism can't be arrested and tried in a court of law.
The court is also why illegal migration is out of control.
Well, imagine the shock for the Tory leadership favourite when he finds out a study by Durham University has found the primary factor in the skyrocketing number of small boat crossings is the former Conservative government's oven-ready Brexit deal, a government Jenrick was a part of. According to the report, it was the then Conservative government's decision to leave the EU without a returns agreement in place, which has led to the skyrocketing number of dangerous small boat crossings. Here are some of the report's key findings. The primary factor behind small boat crossings is the UK's lacking a returns agreement with the EU. The government never assessed the impact of the consequences for leaving the EU without a returns agreement to replace the Dublin regulation and was caught by surprise. The UK did not need to leave this agreement in leaving the EU. Non-EU members have returns agreements with the EU. The lack of a returns agreement fueled an increase in crossings. The report's findings chime with this comment from former Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron.
I'm someone who says we have a problem with illegal migration. You cannot have a situation where boat after boat crosses the channel, leaving a perfectly safe country, France, and coming to another perfectly safe country, Britain. You just can't have that. And so you have to be creative and inventive, and that's what the Rwanda policy is.
And hand on heart, if this had come up when you were PM, would you have gone for this policy?
Well, we'd had a totally different situation because we had a situation where you could return people directly to France. Now, I'd love that situation to be the case again. That's the most sensible thing. People land on a beach in Kent, you take them straight back to France, you therefore break the model of the people's budget.
Shouldn't you be trying to get that?
Well, that's not available at the moment. It's simply not possible
because of
at the moment.
Brexit?
Well, because of the situation we're in.
And UK news channels are finally catching on.
There are also fairly obvious glaring diplomatic hurdles, and that is, it's very hard to send people back to safe third countries if you don't have any agreements to do so. Now, once upon a time, when we were in the EU, we had operated under something called the Dublin regulations, which allowed us to send asylum seekers back, in theory, to the place where they had first arrived and claimed asylum. Those fell away upon Brexit, and we haven't really replaced them. We have half a dozen or so agreements in place.
And on the issue of immigration generally, and contrary to what Mr. Jenrick would have us all believe, we do in fact have control of our borders. The vast majority who come to this country are allowed in after meeting an extremely high visa threshold. We invite many of them in to fill gaps in our health and care sectors which are experiencing desperate staff shortages. The simple fact is immigration is economically beneficial, both as a driver of economic recovery and a vital source of support for our public services.
It's created an arsenal of rights for illegal migrants that are used to gum up our courts. and prevent their removal.
Well, last time I looked, human rights were universal. No government should have the power to decide who they should and should not apply to. If we start stripping away basic human rights from people seeking safety in this country, it actually puts all our rights at risk, yours and mine. Because if any government can just snatch human rights away from any section of society whenever it pleases, then none of us has rights, just privileges that can be taken away by people in power whenever they want.
The right to life, liberty, and a fair trial. These were noble aims, but it all started to go wrong in the 1970s when the court decided the convention was a living document.
The ECHR is a living instrument, and that's a wonderful thing. It means that the rights protected in it will develop over time in accordance with changes to social norms. Staying in the ECHR means our human rights protections can continue to evolve with the times. That's a good thing.
So I'm for leave. What about you?
Well, let's just sit on a shelf for a moment that the European Convention on Human Rights protects our right to a fair trial, freedom of assembly and expression, the right to participate in free elections, freedom of religion, freedom from discrimination, the right to privacy, freedom from torture and degrading treatment. The ECHR has also protected British people from abuses of power by its own government. And leaving the ECHR could result in the UK's trade deal with the EU being terminated because the convention is written into the 2020 Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And if all that's not enough to convince you we should remain, leaving the ECHR would also be a breach of the Good Friday Agreement, which requires that the convention be directly enforceable in Northern Ireland.
You're going to have to leave the ECHR and create our own British Bill of Rights.
Well, let's be clear on this. The course of action Jenrick is proposing, should his party again be elected to government, presupposes we can actually trust the party or government proposing that course of action with our human rights in the first place. When this lot were last in power just months ago, they repeatedly tried to curtail our human rights under the existing convention we're already a part of. In fact, according to International Human Rights Watch, under the last government, the UK was on course to make the list of countries that abuse rather than protect human rights, thanks to the Conservatives' outright onslaught on the rights of its own citizens. Just think about that. And it's easy to see why. During their time in office, they passed new anti-strike laws designed to rob millions of workers of their democratic right to strike, force them to work against their will, and allow them to be sacked if they refused. And that included doctors, nurses, teachers, and many other public sector workers. An Elections Act locked millions of people out of the electoral process, a blatant act of voter suppression by the then Tory government. A new law stripped back our right to protest and limited our rights to judicial review, an affront to the very principles of fairness and government accountability. So please remember all that next time you hear Jenrick or any other politician say this.
You're going to have to leave the ECHR and create our own British Bill of Rights.
If we want to avoid a dangerous chain of events which could one day see Britain joining Russia and Belarus as the only European countries outside the ECHR, we need to constantly call out this insane drumbeat from the right to leave. So please do share this film with family and friends.